In the year 1879, the American frontier was a land of contradictions. It was a place where opportunity and danger walked hand in hand, where fortunes could be made or lost in a single day, and where the line between justice and vengeance often blurred beyond recognition. Among the countless settlements that dotted the vast western territories, Silver Creek stood as a testament to both the promise and the peril of frontier life. Silver Creek was not a large town by Eastern standards. Its population numbered fewer than 800 souls, yet it served as a crucial hub for the surrounding ranching communities. The town had grown rapidly following the discovery of silver deposits in the nearby hills during the early 1870s, though by 1879 the mining boom had largely subsided. What remained was a community sustained by cattle ranching, agriculture, and the constant flow of travelers moving through the territory. At the heart of Silver Creek's social order stood Sheriff Eli Graves, a man whose reputation for fairness and determination had become legendary throughout the region. Graves was not a young man in 1879. At 43 years of age, he had witnessed the transformation of the West from untamed wilderness to a land struggling toward civilization. His weathered face and steady gaze reflected years of experience dealing with the harsh realities of frontier justice. Historical context: the American West in 1879. To understand the events that would unfold in Silver Creek, we must first examine the broader historical context of the American West during this pivotal period. The year 1879 fell within what historians now recognize as the height of the frontier era, a time when federal authority was expanding westward but had not yet established complete control over remote territories. The end of the Civil War in 1865 had unleashed a massive wave of westward migration. Veterans from both sides of the conflict, immigrants from Europe and Asia, freed slaves seeking new opportunities, and countless others driven by economic necessity or the promise of land, all pushed into the western territories. This rapid expansion created communities that existed in a peculiar legal and social limbo, caught between the old ways of frontier self-reliance and the emerging structures of formal governance. Law enforcement in these frontier communities faced unprecedented challenges. The vast distances between settlements, limited communication networks, and the absence of established legal institutions meant that sheriffs and marshals often operated with considerable autonomy. They were expected to maintain order in communities where violence was commonplace, resources were scarce, and the nearest federal courthouse might be hundreds of miles away. The concept of justice in the Old West was shaped by these practical realities. While territorial and federal laws existed on paper, their enforcement depended entirely on the capabilities and character of individual lawmen. Sheriffs like Eli Graves were not merely police officers in the modern sense. They served as investigators, judges, jailers, and sometimes executioners, wielding enormous power over the communities they served. The role of frontier sheriffs. The position of sheriff in a frontier town carried both authority and danger. Unlike modern law enforcement officers who work within clearly defined legal frameworks and robust support systems, frontier sheriffs operated with limited resources and faced threats that could emerge from any direction. Sheriffs were typically elected by the communities they served, which meant they needed to maintain public support while upholding the law. This created inherent tensions, particularly when legal principles conflicted with community desires. A sheriff who consistently acted against popular opinion might find himself voted out of office, or, in extreme cases, facing direct challenges to his authority. The daily responsibilities of a frontier sheriff were diverse and demanding. They included investigating crimes, apprehending suspects, maintaining a jail, serving legal papers, collecting taxes, and occasionally organizing posses to pursue dangerous criminals. In many cases, sheriffs also served as the primary liaison between their communities and territorial or federal authorities. Eli Graves had served as Silver Creek's sheriff for 7 years by 1879. His appointment had come at a time when the town was struggling with lawlessness in the wake of the mining boom. Previous sheriffs had either proven ineffective or had been driven out by the powerful interests that sought to control the town for their own benefit. Graves had established order through a combination of firm enforcement, fair dealing, and an unwavering commitment to the rule of law. His methods were rooted in a philosophy that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. While other lawmen relied primarily on intimidation and quick justice, Graves insisted on thorough investigations and adherence to proper legal procedures whenever possible. He maintained detailed records of arrests and trials, communicated regularly with territorial authorities, and refused to be swayed by threats or bribes. Cattle rustling, the crime that threatened the West. Among the various crimes that plagued frontier communities, Cattle rustling held a special place of infamy. The theft of livestock was not merely a property crime in the context of the Old West. It struck at the very foundation of the regional economy and threatened the livelihoods of entire communities. Cattle ranching had become the dominant economic activity across much of the Western territories by the late 1870s. The expansion of railroad networks made it possible to transport beef to eastern markets, transforming cattle from subsistence animals into valuable commercial commodities. Large ranches, some spanning hundreds of thousands of acres, employed dozens of cowboys and represented significant capital investments. The open-range system that predominated during this era made cattle particularly vulnerable to theft. Livestock roamed freely across vast expanses of unfenced land, identified only by brands burned into their hides. Rustlers could easily alter or obscure these brands, mix stolen cattle with legitimate herds, and transport them to distant markets where questions were rarely asked. The impact of cattle rustling extended beyond mere economic loss. For ranchers who had invested everything in their herds, the theft of even a few animals could mean financial ruin. Communities dependent on the cattle industry viewed rustling as an existential threat, and their responses were often swift and brutal. Vigilante justice became a common response to cattle theft throughout the West. Ranchers' associations organized their own enforcement efforts, hiring stock detectives and forming posses that operated outside formal legal channels. Suspected rustlers, when caught, frequently faced immediate execution without trial. Hangings carried out by vigilante groups were so common that certain trees became known as hanging trees, grim landmarks of frontier justice. This culture of extra-legal punishment created significant challenges for lawmen who sought to uphold proper legal procedures. Sheriffs found themselves caught between the demand for swift retribution and their duty to ensure fair trials and due process. The tension between these competing imperatives would come to define Eli Graves' greatest challenge. Silver Creek, a community at a crossroads. By 1879, Silver Creek had evolved into a community with distinct social and economic divisions. The town's physical layout reflected these divisions clearly. Main Street housed the commercial establishments, the general store, the bank, 2 saloons, a hotel, and the sheriff's office with its small jail. Surrounding this central corridor were the homes of merchants, professionals, and craftsmen who served the town's needs. Beyond the town proper lay the ranches that formed the economic backbone of the region. 3 large ranching operations dominated the surrounding territory. The largest of these, the Triple Bar Ranch, was owned by Marcus Brennan, a former Confederate officer who had come west after the war and built an empire through a combination of shrewd business practices and ruthless elimination of competitors. The town's population was diverse, reflecting the varied streams of migration that had flowed into the West. There were former soldiers, failed miners who had turned to other pursuits, immigrants from Ireland and Germany, Mexican vaqueros whose families had lived in the region for generations, and even a small community of Chinese laborers who had remained after working on railroad construction. This diversity created both strength and friction within Silver Creek. Different groups brought different expectations about law, justice, and social order. What one community considered proper legal procedure, another might view as unnecessary delay or weakness. Eli Graves had learned to navigate these cultural differences with diplomatic skill, but he could not always satisfy everyone. The economic power structure in Silver Creek was less diverse. Real authority rested with the major ranchers, the bank owner, and a handful of successful merchants. These men formed an informal council that made many of the decisions affecting the town's future. While Silver Creek had a nominal town council elected by the residents, significant matters were often decided in private meetings among the economic elite. Eli Graves maintained a careful independence from this power structure. He understood that effective law enforcement required some cooperation with the town's influential citizens, but he refused to become their instrument. This independence had earned him respect from ordinary residents, but had also created tensions with those accustomed to having their way. The social fabric of frontier justice. The concept of justice in Silver Creek, as in most frontier communities, was shaped by practical necessities and cultural expectations that differed markedly from established legal traditions. The formal legal system that governed the eastern states, with its multiple layers of courts, professional attorneys, and elaborate procedural safeguards, simply did not exist in most Western territories. Trials, when they occurred, were often informal affairs. A local judge, frequently a man with no formal legal training, would preside over proceedings held in a saloon, a hotel, or sometimes outdoors. Juries were assembled from available townsmen, and the entire process from arrest to verdict might be completed within days or even hours. This informal system was vulnerable to manipulation by powerful interests, and prone to reflecting community prejudices rather than objective justice. Defendants who lacked social standing or who belonged to marginalized groups faced particular disadvantages. The absence of professional legal representation meant that an accused person's fate often depended more on community sentiment than on the actual evidence. Public opinion played an enormous role in frontier justice. In small communities where everyone knew everyone else, reputations were powerful currency. A man known as honest and hard-working might receive sympathy and fair consideration, even when accused of serious crimes. Conversely, someone viewed as disreputable or dangerous might face conviction based on minimal evidence and general suspicion. Eli Graves had witnessed the strengths and weaknesses of this system throughout his career. He had seen guilty men freed because they were popular or well-connected, and he had seen innocent men condemned because they were strangers or belonged to unpopular groups. These experiences had instilled in him a deep skepticism about the reliability of popular justice and a commitment to thorough investigation before rendering judgment. Conclusion. The stage is set. As summer approached in 1879, Silver Creek appeared to be a community that had achieved a measure of stability. The violent chaos of the mining boom years had subsided, replaced by the steady rhythms of ranching life. Eli Graves maintained order with a firm but fair hand, and most residents had come to accept his authority. Yet beneath this surface calm, tensions simmered. The major ranchers, particularly Marcus Brennan of the Triple Bar Ranch, chafed at any perceived weakness in dealing with threats to their property. Cattle rustling incidents had increased in recent months, and pressure was building for more aggressive responses. Some ranchers had begun to question whether the formal legal process was adequate to protect their interests. Eli Graves understood these pressures, but he remained committed to his principles. He believed that abandoning proper legal procedures, even in difficult circumstances, would ultimately undermine the very order everyone sought to preserve. Justice, in his view, required patience, thorough investigation, and resistance to the easy appeal of mob action. This philosophy would soon face its greatest test. An incident was about to occur that would force Eli Graves to choose between his principles and his community's demands, between what was legal and what was popular, between the path of least resistance and the harder road of conscience. The arrest of a young man accused of cattle rustling would set in motion a chain of events that would reveal the true character of both the sheriff and the town he served. The story of Eli Graves and Silver Creek would become a case study in the challenges of frontier justice, a reminder that the struggle between law and lawlessness, between careful deliberation and hasty judgment, was fought not only in dramatic confrontations, but also in the quiet decisions made by individuals who refused to compromise their principles, regardless of the cost. The events that would test Eli Graves's principles and shake Silver Creek to its foundations began on a humid morning in late June 1879. A rider from the Triple Bar Ranch thundered into town just after dawn, his horse lathered with sweat from the hard ride. The message he carried was simple but inflammatory. Cattle had been stolen, and the thief had been caught. Within the hour, a group of armed men had gathered outside the sheriff's office. Leading them was Marcus Brennan himself, a tall, imposing figure whose presence commanded immediate attention. Brennan had not personally ridden into town for a routine matter in over a year. His appearance signaled that this was no ordinary theft, and his expectations for swift justice were clear. Sheriff Eli Graves met the ranchers on the wooden walkway outside his office. His demeanor was calm, his expression unreadable as he listened to their account. What he heard would set in motion a conflict that would ultimately force him to choose between his community's demands and his own conscience. The discovery of the crime. The cattle theft had been discovered early that morning by Triple Bar ranch hands conducting a routine check of the southern grazing areas. According to their report, approximately 20 head of cattle were missing from a section of range near Willow Creek, about 8 miles from the ranch headquarters. The missing animals represented significant value, perhaps as much as $400 at current market prices. What made this theft particularly brazen was its timing and location. The cattle had been taken from an area relatively close to the ranch buildings, suggesting either remarkable audacity or intimate knowledge of the ranch's operations. The thieves had apparently worked during the night, moving the animals away from the main herd with practiced skill. The ranch hands who discovered the theft had immediately begun tracking the missing cattle. The trail was relatively fresh and led southwest, toward the broken country near the territorial border. This was classic Rustler territory, where rough terrain and scattered vegetation made pursuit difficult and provided numerous hiding places. Following the trail for approximately 5 miles, the ranch hands had come upon a small camp, hidden in a ravine. There they found a young man, no more than 20 years old, attempting to rebrand several of the stolen cattle. The evidence appeared damning. The triple bar brand was clearly visible on the animals, and the young man possessed running irons, the tools used to alter brands, along with supplies suggesting he had planned to remain in the area for several days. The ranch hands had immediately apprehended the suspect. According to their account, he had offered no resistance and had made no attempt to flee. They had bound him and brought him directly to the ranch, where Marcus Brennan had questioned him briefly before deciding to bring the matter to the sheriff. The accused, Thomas McCarty, the young man now sitting in Eli Graves' jail cell, was identified as Thomas McCarty. He was a stranger to Silver Creek, having arrived in the area only 3 weeks earlier. Physical appearance suggested a hard life. His clothes were worn and patched, his boots badly scuffed, and his thin frame indicated he had not been eating regularly. McCarty claimed to be a drifter looking for ranch work. He stated that he had worked briefly for several small ranches in the territory, doing odd jobs and temporary labor. He carried no weapons except an old rifle and a knife, possessions typical of a working cowhand or itinerant laborer. When Sheriff Graves interviewed McCarty in the jail cell, the young man's story was consistent but difficult to verify. He claimed he had been hired by a man he knew only as Jack to move some cattle to a buyer across the border. According to McCarty, Jack had told him the cattle were legitimately purchased and that the job was simply to deliver them. McCarty insisted he had not known the animals were stolen and had never intended to commit any crime. This explanation was met with immediate skepticism by Brennan and his men. The presence of running irons in McCarty's possession contradicted his claim of innocent involvement. These tools had virtually no legitimate purpose. They were specifically designed to alter brands and were carried almost exclusively by cattle thieves. Additionally, McCarty could provide no description of Jack beyond vague generalities, and he admitted he had been paid half his wages in advance, an unusual arrangement that suggested the employer's unwillingness to be identified. McCarty's youth and evident poverty made him an unsympathetic figure to some, but also raised questions in Graves' mind. The young man did not fit the profile of a professional rustler. He lacked the hardened demeanor, the network of accomplices, and the escape plan that characterized experienced cattle thieves. His capture had been almost absurdly easy, as if he had been left exposed deliberately. The evidence and initial investigation, Sheriff Graves approached the case with his characteristic thoroughness, despite pressure from Brennan and others to proceed immediately to trial and sentencing. He began by examining the physical evidence and interviewing witnesses to establish the basic facts of the case. The cattle themselves were clear evidence of theft. All bore the triple bar brand, and ranch records confirmed that animals matching their descriptions had been part of the southern herd. The financial impact on Brennan was real and substantial, representing not only the immediate value of the lost animals, but also the potential for future losses if rustling was not dealt with severely. The running irons found in McCarty's possession were examined carefully. These simple tools, essentially metal rods with curved ends, could be heated and used to modify existing brands or create new ones. Their presence was highly incriminating, as Graves well knew. In many frontier communities, mere possession of running irons was considered sufficient evidence of rustling intent. However, Graves noted several details that troubled him. First, the running irons appeared new and showed little evidence of use. The handles were not worn, and there was minimal carbon buildup on the metal ends. If McCarty was an experienced rustler, his tools should have shown more signs of regular employment. Second, the camp itself seemed poorly conceived for a rustling operation. It was located in a ravine that offered concealment, but was also a potential trap with limited escape routes. An experienced thief would have chosen a location with better options for quick departure. The supplies McCarty possessed were minimal, barely enough for a few days, suggesting no long-term plan. Third, and perhaps most significantly, McCarty had been working on the cattle in broad daylight when discovered. Professional rustlers typically worked at night and moved stolen animals quickly to avoid detection. McCarty's behavior suggested either remarkable incompetence or a lack of understanding about what he was actually doing. Graves also interviewed the ranch hands who had discovered McCarty. Their accounts were consistent and credible. They had followed the trail, found the suspect with the cattle, and apprehended him without incident. They had not witnessed the actual theft, only its aftermath. Historical context. Cattle rustling investigations. The investigation Eli Graves was conducting reflected evolving practices in frontier law enforcement during the late 1870s. Earlier in the decade, Suspected cattle thieves were frequently dealt with through immediate vigilante action, with little attention paid to evidence or investigation. By 1879, however, there was growing recognition that proper investigation could prevent mistakes and ensure that the right people were punished. Professional stock detective agencies had begun operating throughout the West, employed by ranchers' associations to investigate thefts and recover stolen property. These detectives brought more sophisticated techniques to their work, including careful examination of brands, tracking of livestock sales, and investigation of suspected thieves' backgrounds and associates. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, founded in 1873, had pioneered many of these practices. By 1879, similar organizations existed throughout the Western territories, creating networks for sharing information about thefts and suspects. Some of these organizations also maintained lists of known rustlers and their methods, helping lawmen identify patterns and connect related crimes. However, these professional investigations coexisted uneasily with traditional frontier justice. Many ranchers viewed careful investigation as unnecessary delay, preferring swift and harsh punishment as a deterrent to future thefts. The tension between thorough investigation and immediate action was a constant challenge for lawmen like Graves, who sought to balance effectiveness with fairness. The legal procedures for handling cattle theft varied significantly across different territories and jurisdictions. In some areas, rustling was treated as simple theft, punishable by imprisonment. In others, it was classified as a more serious crime, deserving of capital punishment. The severity of the penalty often depended less on written law than on local custom and the influence of powerful ranching interests. Community reaction and rising pressure. News of McCarty's arrest spread rapidly through Silver Creek. By midday, a crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office, and the town's saloons buzzed with discussion of the case. Public opinion formed quickly and ran strongly against the accused. The reasons for this hostile reaction were complex. Cattle rustling affected not just the wealthy ranchers, but the entire community's economic well-being. The ranches employed many local residents, purchased supplies from town merchants, and provided the foundation for Silver Creek's prosperity. Threats to the ranching industry were perceived as threats to everyone's livelihood. Additionally, the recent increase in rustling incidents had created a climate of anxiety and anger. Several smaller ranchers had lost animals in preceding months, and there was a widespread belief that organized rustling operations were becoming bolder. McCarty's arrest was seen as an opportunity to send a clear message that such crimes would not be tolerated. Marcus Brennan actively encouraged this sentiment. He made it known that he expected swift justice and that any delay or leniency would be interpreted as weakness. Brennan was a powerful man who wielded considerable influence in Silver Creek. His opinions carried weight not just because of his wealth, but because of his willingness to use both economic pressure and physical intimidation to achieve his goals. Other influential citizens joined Brennan in demanding quick resolution of the case. The bank owner, concerned about the impact of rustling on ranch loans and property values, publicly supported immediate trial and harsh punishment. Several merchants, dependent on rancher business, echoed these sentiments. Even some of Graves's usual allies began suggesting that perhaps this was not the time to be overly concerned with procedural niceties. The pressure on Sheriff Graves intensified as the day progressed. Deputations of concerned citizens visited his office, urging swift action. Some spoke of organizing their own response if the legal system proved inadequate. The implicit threat was clear. If Graves did not act decisively, others might take matters into their own hands. Graves' growing doubts. Despite the mounting pressure and the apparently clear evidence, Eli Graves found himself troubled by aspects of the case that did not align properly. His years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and those instincts were telling him that something about this situation was not quite right. The ease of McCarty's capture bothered him particularly. Professional rustlers were typically cautious, experienced men who understood the risks and took elaborate precautions. They worked with accomplices, planned escape routes, and rarely allowed themselves to be cornered so easily. McCarty, by contrast, had been found alone, working openly in a location with poor escape options. It suggested either extraordinary stupidity or something else entirely. Graves also questioned McCarty's motive. The young man possessed almost no money, yet he claimed to have been paid in advance for moving the cattle. If that were true, where was the money? A search of McCarty's belongings had revealed only a few coins, hardly enough to justify the risk of hanging for cattle theft. If someone had indeed paid him to move the animals, that person had gotten a bargain while leaving McCarty to face all the consequences. The mysterious Jack, who had allegedly hired McCarty, was another troubling element. McCarty's description was so vague as to be useless. A man of average height and build, wearing typical cowhand clothing, with no distinguishing features. It was almost as if McCarty was describing a generic figure rather than a real person. Yet the young man stuck to his story, despite aggressive questioning. Graves interviewed McCarty multiple times, varying his approach and looking for inconsistencies. The young man's account never wavered in its essentials, though he could provide frustratingly few details. He maintained that he was guilty only of poor judgment in accepting work without asking enough questions, not of intentional theft. The sheriff's doubts were not sufficient to establish McCarty's innocence, but they were enough to convince him that the case deserved more investigation before proceeding to trial and sentencing. In particular, he wanted to determine whether McCarty had accomplices, whether the mysterious Jack actually existed, and whether there might be evidence to corroborate or contradict the young man's account. The decision to delay. On the evening of the first day, Marcus Brennan returned to the sheriff's office with a group of prominent citizens. Their message was direct. A trial should be held the following day, and given the clear evidence of guilt, hanging should follow immediately. They argued that swift justice was necessary to deter future rustling and to demonstrate that Silver Creek would not tolerate threats to its economic foundation. Eli Graves listened to their arguments without interruption. When they finished, he delivered his response in the calm, measured tone that characterized his approach to law enforcement. He acknowledged the seriousness of the crime and the strength of the evidence against McCarty. However, he stated that certain aspects of the case required further investigation before he could in good conscience proceed to trial. The sheriff explained his concerns, the inconsistencies in the evidence, the questions about possible accomplices, and the need to verify McCarty's account or establish definitively that it was false. He argued that rushing to judgment might result in punishing a minor participant while allowing the actual organizers of the theft to escape. He requested 3 days to conduct a proper investigation. Brennan's response was immediate and hostile. He accused Graves of weakness and suggested that the sheriff's reluctance to act might stem from sympathy for criminals. Other members of the delegation joined in, arguing that the evidence was already sufficient and that delay served no purpose except to undermine public confidence in the law. The confrontation grew heated. Graves remained firm, stating that as sheriff, he had both the authority and the responsibility to ensure proper investigation before bringing charges. He reminded them that territorial law required adequate evidence and proper procedure, and that vigilante justice was itself a crime that he would not tolerate. The meeting ended with angry words and veiled threats. Brennan and his supporters left the sheriff's office, making clear their displeasure and their intention to seek other remedies if Graves did not act as they wished. The battle lines had been drawn, and the conflict that would define Eli Graves's career had truly begun. Conclusion: the point of no return. As night fell over Silver Creek, Sheriff Eli Graves sat alone in his office, reviewing his notes on the McCarty case. Outside, he could hear the sounds of an agitated town, raised voices from the saloons, groups of men gathering and talking in urgent tones. The general atmosphere of a community worked into a state of righteous anger. Graves understood that his decision to delay had placed him in direct conflict with the town's most powerful citizens. He knew that his insistence on proper investigation would be interpreted by many as weakness or worse. He recognized that he was risking his position, his reputation, and potentially his safety by standing against popular demand. Yet he also knew that abandoning his principles now would destroy everything he had worked to build in Silver Creek. The rule of law meant nothing if it was cast aside whenever it proved inconvenient. Justice required more than satisfying public anger. It required genuine effort to determine truth and assign punishment fairly. The case of Thomas McCarty had become more than a simple cattle rustling investigation. It had become a test of whether Silver Creek would be governed by law or by the passions of the mob, whether careful investigation would be allowed to proceed, or whether expediency would triumph over justice. Eli Graves had made his choice, and there would be no turning back from the path he had chosen. The next days would reveal whether his faith in the law was justified, or whether the forces arrayed against him would prove too powerful to resist. The young man in the jail cell behind him was depending on that investigation, whether he fully understood it or not, and the future of justice in Silver Creek hung in the balance. The morning after his confrontation with Marcus Brennan and the town's influential citizens, Sheriff Eli Graves began his investigation in earnest. He understood that he had perhaps 3 days, maybe less, before the pressure to proceed with McCarty's trial became overwhelming. During that narrow window, he needed to either confirm the young man's guilt beyond reasonable doubt or uncover evidence that might cast the case in a different light. Graves's first action was to deputize a man he trusted, Samuel Chen, a former railroad worker who had settled in Silver Creek and established a reputation for reliability and discretion. Chen was not a typical choice for a deputy in a frontier town. He faced prejudice from some residents due to his Chinese heritage, but Graves valued his sharp observational skills and his independence from the town's social networks. Chen would be less susceptible to pressure from the ranchers and more likely to report what he actually found rather than what others wanted him to find. The investigation would take them beyond Silver Creek's boundaries, into territory where the sheriff's authority was less certain and the dangers more immediate. But Graves knew that answers, if they existed, would not be found in the town's saloons or in repeated interrogations of a prisoner who had already told his story. The truth lay somewhere in the landscape where the crime had occurred, in the details that had been overlooked in the rush to judgment. Re-examining the evidence, Graves and Chen began by returning to the ravine where McCarty had been discovered. The site was approximately 8 miles from town, accessible by a rough trail that wound through broken country characterized by scattered juniper trees, rocky outcroppings, and seasonal creek beds. This was terrain that offered concealment, but also presented challenges for moving cattle quickly. The campsite itself told a story that Graves examined with fresh attention to detail. The fire pit was small and showed evidence of only 1 or 2 uses. The arrangement of supplies suggested a temporary camp rather than an established base of operations. Most significantly, the ground around the camp showed tracks from multiple horses, not just McCarty's single mount. Chen, who had learned tracking skills from Native American railroad workers, studied the hoof prints carefully. He identified at least 3 distinct horses that had been present at the site within the past several days. One set of tracks matched McCarty's horse, currently stabled at the livery in Silver Creek. The other 2 sets were different in size and shoe pattern, indicating different animals and possibly different riders. This discovery was significant. If McCarty had accomplices, as the evidence now suggested, then he might indeed be telling the truth about being hired by someone else. The presence of other riders also raised questions about why McCarty had been found alone. Had his companions abandoned him? Had they observed the approaching ranch hands and fled, leaving McCarty to face capture alone? Graves followed the additional tracks away from the camp. They led northeast, back toward the main road that connected Silver Creek to other settlements in the territory. After approximately 2 miles, the tracks merged with the heavily traveled road and became impossible to distinguish from other traffic. Whoever had left those tracks had departed before McCarty's arrest and had successfully avoided detection. The sheriff also examined the cattle that had been recovered. All 20 animals had been returned to the Triple Bar Ranch, but Graves obtained permission to inspect them. What he found was interesting. The attempts to alter their brands were crude and incomplete. Only 3 of the 20 animals showed any modification to their original Triple Bar brand, and those modifications were so poorly executed that the original brand remained clearly visible. This amateurish work contradicted the profile of an experienced rustling operation. Professional cattle thieves understood that brand alteration required skill and care. The crude attempts on these animals suggested either remarkable incompetence or a hasty, improvised effort by someone unfamiliar with the technique. It supported McCarty's claim that he was not a professional rustler, though it did not prove his innocence. Investigating McCarty's background. While Chen continued examining the physical evidence, Graves turned his attention to learning more about Thomas McCarty himself. The young man claimed to be a drifter who had worked at various ranches in the territory. If that story was true, someone might remember him and be able to provide information about his character and behavior. Graves spent a full day riding to neighboring ranches and small settlements, showing a description of McCarty and asking if anyone recognized him. The effort yielded mixed results. 2 ranch foremen recalled hiring a young man matching McCarty's description for temporary work within the past 2 months. Both described him as a competent worker who had caused no trouble and had moved on after completing his assigned tasks. Neither of these ranchers reported any thefts or suspicious behavior associated with McCarty's employment. This was significant. If McCarty was indeed a cattle thief, he would likely have left a trail of missing livestock at the places where he had worked. The absence of such a pattern suggested that either he was remarkably cautious or he was not, in fact, a habitual criminal. However, Graves also discovered gaps in McCarty's story. The young man claimed to have worked at 4 ranches in the territory, but the sheriff could only confirm employment at 2. The other 2 ranches McCarty mentioned either did not exist at the locations he specified or had no record of employing anyone matching his description. These discrepancies were troubling and suggested that McCarty might be lying about at least some aspects of his background. The investigation into McCarty's past also revealed information about his family situation. Through inquiries sent by telegraph to authorities in neighboring territories, Graves learned that McCarty's father had been killed in a mining accident 3 years earlier, leaving the family destitute. His mother and younger siblings were living in difficult circumstances in a settlement 2 territories away. This information provided a possible motive for McCarty's actions. Desperate poverty might have driven him to accept questionable employment, or even to participate in theft. The mysterious employer. The most crucial and frustrating aspect of Graves's investigation involved McCarty's claim about being hired by a man named Jack. If this person existed and could be found, he might provide the key to understanding what had actually happened. If the claim was fabricated, it represented an obvious attempt by McCarty to shift blame and avoid responsibility. Graves approached this question systematically. He interviewed everyone in Silver Creek who might have information about strangers passing through town in recent weeks. The hotel keeper, saloon operators, livery stable owner, and various merchants were all questioned about unfamiliar faces and unusual behavior. This effort produced interesting information. Several witnesses recalled a man who had spent 2 nights in Silver Creek approximately 1 week before McCarty's arrest. The descriptions varied in details, but a composite picture emerged. A man in his 30s or 40s, well-dressed by frontier standards, riding a quality horse and carrying himself with confidence. He had paid cash for his accommodations and supplies, asked questions about local ranches and cattle prices, and then departed without stating his destination. The timeline was suggestive. If this man had recruited McCarty for the cattle theft, a week would have provided adequate time to plan the operation and position the young man for his role. However, no one could definitively connect this stranger to McCarty, and his generic description matched hundreds of men who might pass through a frontier town. Graves also investigated whether anyone local might be using the name Jack as an alias. He considered whether the mysterious employer might actually be someone from Silver Creek itself, someone with knowledge of the Triple Bar Ranch and its operations. This line of inquiry led him to examine recent conflicts and business disputes involving Marcus Brennan. What he discovered was illuminating. Brennan had made numerous enemies during his rise to prominence in the territory. He had acquired much of his land through aggressive tactics that bordered on, and sometimes crossed, legal boundaries. Several smaller ranchers had been forced out of business by methods that included disputed property claims, strategic blocking of water access, and alleged intimidation of potential buyers for their cattle. Among those who had suffered losses due to Brennan's business practices were at least 3 individuals who might have motive to strike back by stealing his cattle or framing someone else for such theft. However, none of these suspects matched the description of the well-dressed stranger, and Graves found no direct evidence connecting any of them to the crime. Historical context. Due process in frontier America. The investigation Sheriff Graves was conducting reflected an evolving understanding of legal procedure in the American West during the late 1870s. The concept of due process, enshrined in the 5th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, held that individuals could not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without proper legal procedures. However, the application of this principle in frontier territories was inconsistent and often controversial. Many frontier communities operated under an informal understanding that swift justice was necessary for survival. The argument held that the harsh conditions and limited resources of the frontier required practical solutions rather than elaborate legal procedures. Waiting for proper trials, gathering extensive evidence, and ensuring all procedural safeguards might allow criminals to escape or encourage others to commit similar crimes. This perspective was reinforced by real challenges in frontier law enforcement. The vast distances between settlements, limited communication capabilities, and absence of secure jails meant that holding suspects for extended periods was genuinely difficult. Witnesses might scatter before a trial could be convened. Evidence might deteriorate or disappear. Suspects might escape from makeshift detention facilities. Against this practical argument stood a competing vision of Western settlement that emphasized the importance of bringing civilization and its institutions to the frontier. Proponents of this view argued that abandoning legal principles in the name of expediency would create lawless societies where power rather than justice determined outcomes. They pointed to the frequent mistakes made by vigilante groups and the tendency of mob justice to target unpopular minorities rather than actual criminals. Several high-profile cases in the 1870s had brought national attention to these issues. In Montana, the vigilante execution of suspected road agents had resulted in the deaths of innocent men, along with genuine criminals. In Texas, organized vigilante groups had evolved into virtual private armies that terrorized communities under the guise of law enforcement. These excesses had prompted calls for reform and greater adherence to proper legal procedures. By 1879, territorial governments throughout the West were attempting to establish more formal legal systems. Circuit judges traveled between settlements to conduct proper trials. Telegraph communication allowed for verification of suspects' identities and backgrounds. Professional law enforcement, including territorial marshals and stock detectives, brought more sophisticated investigative techniques to frontier communities. Yet the tension between formal procedure and frontier pragmatism remained unresolved. Sheriffs like Eli Graves found themselves navigating between competing expectations, upholding legal principles while maintaining community support, conducting thorough investigations while acting with sufficient speed to prevent vigilante action, and balancing the rights of the accused against the legitimate concerns of crime victims. Discovery of hidden interests. On the third day of his investigation, Graves made a discovery that cast the entire case in a new light. While examining land records at the territorial office, he found documentation of a recent property dispute involving land adjacent to the Triple Bar Ranch. The land in question, approximately 2,000 acres of good grazing territory with reliable water access, was being claimed by two parties, Marcus Brennan and a consortium of smaller ranchers led by a man named William Dutch. The dispute had been ongoing for several months and involved conflicting interpretations of original survey markers and competing claims based on prior use. The land's value was substantial, potentially worth tens of thousands of dollars. More importantly, control of this territory would significantly impact the viability of the smaller ranchers' operations. If Brennan won the dispute, he would effectively control water access for the entire region, potentially forcing his competitors out of business. Graves learned that a hearing on the property dispute had been scheduled for the following month. The outcome would likely depend on testimony from various witnesses and evaluation of documentary evidence. Both sides had been gathering support and preparing their cases. What made this information particularly relevant was a detail Graves discovered through further inquiry. The stolen cattle had been taken from the disputed territory. Brennan had moved part of his herd onto the land to establish his claim of prior use and continuous occupation. The theft of those specific animals could potentially weaken his position in the upcoming hearing. This raised an uncomfortable possibility that the cattle theft might not be simply about stealing valuable animals, but about undermining Brennan's legal position in the property dispute. If someone wanted to damage Brennan's claim, arranging for the theft of cattle from the disputed land and ensuring the theft was publicly known would serve that purpose. The actual value of the stolen animals would be secondary to the symbolic and legal impact of the theft. Graves also discovered that William Dutch, leader of the opposing consortium, had been in the vicinity of Silver Creek around the time when the mysterious, well-dressed stranger had been reported in town. Dutch matched some elements of the description: confident bearing, quality horse, interest in local ranching matters. However, Dutch was well known in the region, and it seemed unlikely that witnesses would have failed to recognize him if he had been the stranger in question. Nevertheless, this discovery suggested possible motives beyond simple theft. If powerful interests were maneuvering against each other, Thomas McCarty might be merely a pawn in a larger conflict, used and then abandoned by people playing for much higher stakes than 20 head of cattle, confronting buried secrets. The investigation had also forced Eli Graves to confront aspects of his own past that he had long tried to forget. Years earlier, during his time as a deputy in another territory, he had participated in a rushed trial that had resulted in the hanging of a man accused of murder. Only later had evidence emerged suggesting the executed man's innocence. The case had haunted Graves and had fundamentally shaped his approach to law enforcement. That experience had taught him that popular certainty was not the same as actual truth, that compelling evidence could be misleading, and that the pressure to act swiftly could result in irreversible injustice. It had instilled in him a deep skepticism about cases that seemed too clear-cut, too obvious in their apparent guilt. His insistence on thorough investigation in McCarty's case was rooted not just in abstract principle, but in painful personal knowledge of what could go wrong when justice was rushed. This history, also explained why Graves was willing to endure the criticism and pressure now mounting against him. He had lived with the consequences of failing to ask enough questions, of accepting surface appearances instead of digging deeper. He had learned that the temporary approval of a community was worth far less than the ability to look at himself in a mirror without shame. As the third day of his investigation drew to a close, Graves reviewed everything he had learned. The evidence against McCarty remained substantial. He had been caught with stolen cattle and tools for altering brands. His explanation relied on an employer who could not be found and whose existence could not be verified. Some aspects of his background story could not be confirmed. Yet the investigation had also revealed troubling inconsistencies. The presence of other riders at the camp, the amateurish nature of the brand alteration, the absence of a prior criminal history, and the possibility that larger conflicts might be involved. Most significantly, the investigation had suggested questions that had not been asked, and possibilities that had not been considered in the rush to judgment. Conclusion: the cost of conscience. As Graves returned to Silver Creek on the evening of the third day, he knew that his time for investigation had effectively run out. The town was in an ugly mood. Marcus Brennan had spent the days stirring up anger about the delay, suggesting that Graves's investigation was merely a pretext for protecting a criminal. Crowds gathered each evening outside the jail, demanding that McCarty be tried and hanged. Some voices now openly called for vigilante action if the legal system would not act. The sheriff understood that he faced a decision that would define not just this case, but his entire career, and perhaps his life. The evidence he had gathered did not definitively prove McCarty's innocence, but it raised sufficient doubt that proceeding immediately to hanging would be unconscionable. Yet refusing to act would likely result in the very vigilante violence he sought to prevent, might cost him his badge, and would certainly make him a pariah in the community he had served for 7 years. Graves also recognized that powerful interests were arrayed against him. If his suspicions about the property dispute and hidden motives were correct, then Brennan and possibly others had strong reasons to want this case resolved quickly without too many questions being asked. Standing in their way was dangerous in ways that went beyond mere political pressure. That night, sitting alone in his office with Thomas McCarty locked in a cell behind him, Eli Graves made his decision. He would not permit a hanging based on the current evidence. He would demand a proper trial with adequate time for defense. He would present his findings about the inconsistencies and unanswered questions in the case, and he would accept whatever consequences followed from that choice. The decision meant confronting not just Marcus Brennan and the town's power structure, but also the accumulated anger of citizens who genuinely believed swift punishment was necessary for community safety. It meant risking violence, losing his position, and possibly endangering his own life. It meant choosing principle over pragmatism, law over popularity, conscience over survival. But for Eli Graves, haunted by a past mistake and committed to a vision of justice that transcended expedience, there was no other choice he could live with. The search for truth had revealed enough doubt that proceeding to execution would be murder, not justice. Whatever the cost, he would not be party to that outcome. The confrontation everyone had been anticipating was now inevitable. Silver Creek would have to decide whether it was a community governed by law or by the will of its most powerful citizens, and Eli Graves would discover whether his faith in legal principles could survive the collision with frontier reality. The confrontation came on the 4th morning after Thomas McCarty's arrest. Sheriff Eli Graves arrived at his office before dawn to find a crowd already gathering in the street. The assembly was larger and more agitated than on previous days, numbering perhaps 200 people, nearly a quarter of Silver Creek's entire population. At the front stood Marcus Brennan, flanked by several of his ranch hands and other prominent citizens who had grown increasingly vocal in their demands for immediate justice. Graves understood immediately that this was the decisive moment. The investigation he had conducted, the doubts he had uncovered, the questions he had raised, all of it now had to be presented and defended before a community that had largely already made up its mind. The evidence of possible broader conspiracies, the inconsistencies in the case against McCarty, the procedural concerns that troubled him, all had to be weighed against the community's fear, anger, and desire for swift resolution. Deputy Samuel Chen stood beside Graves on the wooden walkway outside the sheriff's office. The presence of the deputy, a man who faced his own share of prejudice in Silver Creek, was both a statement of solidarity and a recognition of the danger they both faced. The crowd's mood was volatile, teetering between legal process and vigilante action. The next few hours would determine which path Silver Creek would follow. The public confrontation. Marcus Brennan stepped forward to address the sheriff, his voice loud enough to carry to the assembled crowd. His words were carefully chosen to inflame sentiment while maintaining a veneer of respect for legal procedure. He acknowledged Graves' years of service to Silver Creek, but suggested that the sheriff's judgment had been compromised by misplaced sympathy for a criminal. He argued that the evidence against McCarty was overwhelming and that further delay served no purpose except to undermine public confidence in law enforcement. The rancher's speech was effective. Members of the crowd voiced their agreement, and the general mood grew more hostile. Some began to shout demands that McCarty be turned over for immediate hanging. Others called for Graves to step aside and allow someone else to handle the matter. The situation was rapidly approaching the point where rational discussion would become impossible. Graves waited for the noise to subside before responding. When he spoke, his tone was calm and measured, a deliberate contrast to the heated emotions around him. He began by acknowledging the seriousness of cattle rustling and the legitimate concerns of the ranching community. He recognized that the crime had caused real financial harm to Brennan and represented a threat that needed to be addressed seriously. However, he then laid out the results of his investigation, presenting each piece of evidence and each troubling inconsistency in careful detail. He explained the presence of additional riders at the camp where McCarty was found, the amateurish nature of the brand alteration attempts, the absence of prior criminal history, and the questions surrounding McCarty's claimed employer. He described the property dispute involving the very land where the cattle had been stolen and raised the possibility that larger conflicts might be involved. Most importantly, Graves argued that while McCarty might indeed be guilty, the case contained sufficient uncertainty that proceeding immediately to execution without a proper trial would be a miscarriage of justice. He reminded the crowd that territorial law required adequate opportunity for defense, and that rushing to judgment risked punishing the wrong person or missing the true organizers of the crime. The sheriff's presentation was thorough and professional, but it was also clear that many in the crowd were unmoved. The details of his investigation, the nuances of evidence and procedure, carried little weight against the simple narrative of a cattle thief caught in the act. For many present, Graves's careful reasoning sounded like excuse-making, his concerns about procedure like obstacles to necessary action. The challenge to authority. Brennan's response to Graves's presentation was swift and cutting. He dismissed the sheriff's concerns as irrelevant technicalities that ignored the fundamental facts of the case. He argued that the presence of other riders, even if true, did not exonerate McCarty but only suggested he had accomplices who should also be hunted down. He characterized the investigation as a waste of time that had produced speculation rather than evidence of innocence. The rancher then shifted his argument to more dangerous ground. He suggested that Graves's reluctance to act might stem from corruption or cowardice, rather than principled commitment to justice. He implied that perhaps the sheriff had been influenced by interests opposed to the ranching community, or that he lacked the courage to make difficult decisions. These accusations, though carefully phrased to avoid direct slander, were calculated to undermine Graves's authority and legitimacy. Several other voices in the crowd joined in supporting Brennan's position. The bank owner spoke about the economic impact of rustling on the entire community. A merchant talked about the need to maintain order and protect property rights. Even some who had previously supported Graves began to waver, swayed by the argument that delay was serving no useful purpose and might be actively harmful. The confrontation had now moved beyond debate about the specific case to a fundamental challenge to Graves's authority as sheriff. Brennan was effectively asking the community to choose between the elected lawman who insisted on proper procedure and the powerful interests demanding immediate action. The question was whether Silver Creek would be governed by law or by the will of its most influential citizens. Graves recognized this challenge for what it was, an attempt to circumvent legal process by making it politically impossible for him to function as sheriff. If he yielded to this pressure, he would establish the precedent that his authority existed only at the sufferance of the town's elite. Every future decision would be subject to similar challenges, whenever it conflicted with powerful interests. The sheriff's response was direct and uncompromising. He stated clearly that as long as he held the office of sheriff, he would conduct law enforcement according to his best judgment and in accordance with territorial law. He would not permit vigilante action, would not allow mob rule to supersede legal procedure, and would not turn over a prisoner for execution without a proper trial. If the community was dissatisfied with his performance, they could remove him from office through legitimate means. But until that happened, he would fulfill his duties as he understood them. This declaration represented the point of no return. Graves had drawn a line and dared the community to cross it. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some appeared impressed by his courage and conviction. Others grew angrier, shouting threats and demanding immediate action. The situation had become genuinely dangerous. The revelation, at this critical moment, Deputy Chen stepped forward with information that would transform the entire situation. During the confrontation, he had continued investigating on his own initiative, following up on details from Graves's research. What he had discovered provided the breakthrough the case needed. Chen had located a rancher from a neighboring county who recognized the description of the mysterious, well-dressed stranger. This rancher identified the man as Jack Dalton, a known intermediary who brokered deals between cattle buyers and sellers throughout the territory. Dalton had a reputation as someone who operated in the gray areas of legality, arranging transactions that might involve stolen livestock or disputed ownership without directly participating in thefts himself. More significantly, Chen had found a witness who had seen Dalton meeting with Thomas McCarty at a small settlement 2 weeks before the theft. The witness, a telegraph operator, recalled the meeting because Dalton had sent a telegram afterward, and the operator had noted the unusual routing and coded language of the message. While the operator could not recall the specific content, he remembered that it had been addressed to someone in Silver Creek itself. This information was crucial because it corroborated McCarty's story about being hired by someone named Jack. It established that Dalton existed, that he had contact with McCarty, and that he was communicating with someone in Silver Creek. The coded telegram suggested planning and coordination beyond what a simple drifter like McCarty could have organized. Chen also revealed another critical discovery. Through patient examination of property records and business transactions, he had found a connection between Jack Dalton and the property dispute involving Brennan's ranch. Dalton had previously worked as an agent for William Dutch, the leader of the consortium opposing Brennan in the land claim. While this connection did not prove that Dutch had organized the cattle theft, it established a plausible motive and a potential network for carrying out such an operation. The deputy's revelations created immediate confusion in the crowd. The simple narrative of a caught thief suddenly became more complex, involving possible conspiracies, property disputes, and manipulation by unseen parties. The certainty that had driven demands for immediate hanging gave way to uncertainty and questions. The trial and resolution. In the wake of Chen's discoveries, even Marcus Brennan could not maintain the argument for immediate execution. The evidence now suggested a more complicated situation that required proper investigation and legal resolution. Grudgingly, the rancher agreed that a formal trial should proceed, though he insisted it should happen quickly and that all involved parties should be vigorously prosecuted. The trial of Thomas McCarty took place 1 week later, presided over by a territorial judge who traveled to Silver Creek specifically for the case. The proceedings lasted 2 full days and involved testimony from multiple witnesses, presentation of physical evidence, and examination of the broader context surrounding the alleged crime. The prosecution presented the case against McCarty based on the circumstances of his arrest. He had been found with stolen cattle, possessed tools for altering brands, and could not adequately account for his actions. The evidence of his guilt on the charge of cattle theft appeared strong, and the prosecutor argued for conviction and harsh sentencing. However, the defense, funded by several citizens who had been moved by Graves's investigation, presented a more nuanced picture. They argued that McCarty had indeed participated in moving stolen cattle, but had done so unknowingly, genuinely believing he had been hired for legitimate work. They presented testimony about his previous employment record, his family's desperate circumstances, and his lack of criminal history. They emphasized the evidence of other participants and suggested that McCarty was a pawn used by more sophisticated criminals. Most significantly, the defense called attention to the larger questions surrounding the case, the property dispute, the connections to Jack Dalton, and the possibility that the theft was part of a scheme to influence the land claim. While they could not prove these allegations definitively, they raised sufficient doubt about whether McCarty understood the criminal nature of his actions to warrant consideration of reduced charges. After deliberation, the jury reached a verdict that reflected the complexity of the case. They found McCarty guilty of unlawful possession of stolen property, a lesser charge than cattle rustling itself. This verdict acknowledged his involvement in the crime, while recognizing the mitigating circumstances and questions about his intent. The judge sentenced McCarty to 2 years in territorial prison, a significant penalty but far less severe than the hanging that had been demanded. The verdict satisfied no one completely, but represented a reasonable compromise given the evidence. Brennan and his supporters felt that justice had been inadequately served, and that McCarty had escaped proper punishment. Others, including those troubled by the rush to judgment, felt that an innocent man had been convicted to appease powerful interests. Graves himself viewed the outcome as imperfect but acceptable given the available evidence. Historical context. The evolution of frontier law. The resolution of the McCarty case represented a significant moment in the evolution of law enforcement in Silver Creek, and similar frontier communities throughout the American West. The case illustrated the ongoing tension between traditional frontier justice, characterized by swift and often harsh punishment, and emerging legal systems that emphasized procedure, evidence, and proportional sentencing. By the late 1870s, frontier territories were undergoing a transition from informal community-based justice to more formal legal systems modeled on those in established states. This transition was driven by multiple factors: increasing population density that made vigilante justice more dangerous, economic development that required stable legal frameworks, and political pressure from territorial governments and federal authorities seeking to impose order on the West. The role of sheriffs in this transition was particularly complex. As elected officials, they needed to maintain community support to remain in office. As law enforcement officers, they were expected to uphold territorial and federal law, even when it conflicted with local preferences. As individuals, they faced genuine danger when their decisions angered powerful interests or popular sentiment. Sheriffs who insisted on proper procedure, as Graves had done, often faced serious consequences. Some were voted out of office or forced to resign. Others faced violence from vigilante groups or individuals they had crossed. A few became celebrated for their courage and principle, though often only in retrospect, after their immediate conflicts had faded into history. The establishment of formal trial procedures, even in frontier settings, represented important progress toward genuine rule of law. The presence of trained judges, the opportunity for defense representation, and the requirement of jury deliberation all served to reduce the likelihood of gross injustice compared to vigilante action or summary execution. While these procedures were still far from perfect and remained vulnerable to local prejudices and power imbalances, they represented meaningful improvement over the alternatives. The McCarty trial also illustrated the growing sophistication of criminal investigation in the West. The use of systematic evidence gathering, background investigation, analysis of motives and connections, and careful documentation of findings all reflected evolving professional standards in law enforcement. These methods, pioneered by stock detective agencies and adopted by progressive sheriffs like Graves, would eventually become standard practice throughout American law enforcement. The aftermath and consequences for Eli Graves. The immediate aftermath of the trial brought mixed consequences for Sheriff Eli Graves. He had succeeded in preventing a likely miscarriage of justice and had ensured that McCarty received a fair trial rather than summary execution. His investigation had uncovered important information about the complexity of the case and had raised serious questions about the motives and methods of those involved in the cattle theft. However, these achievements came at significant personal and professional cost. Marcus Brennan and his allies never forgave Graves for the delay and for challenging their authority. The rancher used his considerable economic influence to make life difficult for the sheriff, pressuring merchants who dealt with Graves, spreading rumors about his competence and integrity, and working behind the scenes to undermine his political support. When the next election for sheriff came around, Graves faced a well-funded opponent backed by the ranching interests. The campaign was bitter, with Graves's handling of the McCarty case becoming a central issue. His opponents portrayed him as soft on crime, more concerned with procedural niceties than with protecting the community's economic interests. They argued that his approach to law enforcement was unsuited to frontier conditions, and that Silver Creek needed a sheriff who would act decisively rather than hesitate and investigate. Graves lost that election by a narrow margin. The vote largely divided along economic and social lines, with ranchers and their employees supporting his opponent, while smaller farmers, merchants, and working people tended to support Graves. The result reflected the fundamental division within Silver Creek about what kind of community it wanted to be and what principles should guide its development. After leaving office, Graves remained in Silver Creek for several more years, working as a private investigator and occasionally serving as a deputy marshal for territorial authorities. His expertise and integrity were valued by those who understood the importance of thorough investigation and proper procedure, even if the local political climate had turned against him. The loss of his position was painful, but Graves never expressed regret about his handling of the McCarty case. In later interviews, he stated that he had done what he believed was right, and that he could accept the consequences of standing by his principles. He noted that the alternative, rushing to hang a man based on incomplete evidence and under pressure from powerful interests, would have haunted him far more than losing an election. The fate of Thomas McCarty and the broader investigation. Thomas McCarty served 18 months of his 2-year sentence before being released for good behavior. Upon release, he returned to his family in the neighboring territory and worked to support his mother and siblings. According to subsequent records, He never again faced criminal charges and lived a quiet, law-abiding life until his death many years later. The broader investigation into the cattle theft and the property dispute continued for several months after the trial. Federal authorities, alerted by Graves's findings, launched an inquiry into Jack Dalton's activities. Dalton was eventually apprehended and charged with organizing multiple cattle theft operations throughout the territory. His trial revealed an extensive network of rustling that had been operating for years, using desperate young men like McCarty as expendable participants while the organizers remained safely in the background. William Dutch, the rancher who had been in conflict with Brennan over the disputed land, was questioned extensively but never charged with direct involvement in the cattle theft. However, the investigation did reveal that he had employed Dalton for other purposes and had been aware of his questionable methods. This revelation damaged Dutch's position in the property dispute, and the land eventually went to Brennan through a negotiated settlement. The resolution of these various threads vindicated much of what Graves had suspected during his investigation. The case had indeed involved more than a simple cattle theft. Hidden motives, powerful interests, and a network of criminal activity had all played roles in the events surrounding McCarty's arrest. The rush to judgment that Graves had resisted would have punished a minor participant while leaving the true organizers free to continue their operations. Legacy and lessons. The story of Eli Graves and the McCarty case became part of Silver Creek's history, and over time, part of the broader narrative of law enforcement in the American West. As the frontier era faded and the West became more settled and civilized, the events of 1879 were remembered as an example of the challenges faced by those who sought to establish genuine rule of law in difficult circumstances. Historians examining the period have noted several important lessons from the case. First, it demonstrated that popular opinion and actual justice do not always align. Communities facing fear and economic threat can quickly embrace harsh measures that may feel satisfying but prove unjust when examined carefully. The role of law enforcement includes not just responding to community demands, but also ensuring that responses are measured, appropriate, and based on solid evidence. Second, the case illustrated the importance of thorough investigation even under pressure for quick action. The details uncovered by Graves's patient work, the connections revealed through systematic inquiry, and the broader context established through careful research all proved crucial to understanding what had actually happened. Rushing to judgment based on surface appearances would have resulted in significant injustice. Third, the personal cost paid by Graves for standing by his principles highlighted the challenges faced by those who prioritize integrity over popularity. In the short term, doing the right thing often carries penalties rather than rewards. Graves lost his position, his influence, and his standing in the community. Yet in the longer term, his actions established a standard of professional conduct that influenced subsequent law enforcement in the region. The evolution of Western law enforcement from informal frontier justice to professional procedure-based systems was neither simple nor inevitable. Required individuals willing to insist on proper methods even when those methods were unpopular. It required communities willing to accept that justice sometimes meant restraint rather than action, investigation rather than assumption, and proportional punishment rather than harsh retribution. Silver Creek itself gradually evolved in the decades following the McCarty case. The property disputes that had characterized the early period were resolved through legal processes rather than violence. The cattle industry matured and developed more sophisticated methods for preventing theft and recovering stolen property. The town's institutions, including its law enforcement, became more professional and more committed to proper procedure. Conclusion: the price and value of principle. The story of Sheriff Eli Graves and his refusal to hang Thomas McCarty without proper investigation stands as a testament to the ongoing struggle between expedience and principle, between power and justice, between the easy path and the right one. In Silver Creek in 1879, that struggle played out in a conflict that tested one man's commitment to law and ultimately cost him his position. Graves' decision to resist pressure from Marcus Brennan and other powerful interests, to conduct a thorough investigation, despite community anger, and to insist on a proper trial rather than summary execution, represented a choice that many frontier lawmen faced but not all made. The easier path would have been to give the crowd what it wanted, to hang McCarty and move on, to prioritize community harmony over individual justice. That Graves chose the harder path, that he was willing to sacrifice his career for his principles, speaks to the character required to establish genuine rule of law in frontier conditions. His actions did not produce immediate gratitude or lasting political success. They did, however, prevent a likely miscarriage of justice, reveal important truths about criminal networks operating in the territory, and establish a standard of professional conduct that influenced others. The American West's transition from lawless frontier to civilized society was built on countless individual decisions by sheriffs, judges, and ordinary citizens who insisted that law meant something more than the will of the powerful or the anger of the mob. The story of Eli Graves reminds us that this transition was neither automatic nor painless. It required courage, integrity, and willingness to pay personal costs for public principles. In our contemporary world, where pressure for quick judgments and simple narratives remains strong, the lessons from Silver Creek retain their relevance. Justice requires patience, thorough investigation, and resistance to popular passion. It demands that we look beyond surface appearances and easy conclusions. It asks that we value truth over convenience and principle over expedience, even when doing so carries personal costs. Eli Graves paid such costs and never regretted his choice. His legacy lives on as a reminder that the rule of law depends ultimately not on systems and procedures alone, but on individuals willing to uphold those systems and procedures when it matters most.